If you can't hear me, please let me know, or if you have any issues. And the recording has started. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining us today. These webinars are a lot of fun to do. It's always fun to see the different counties checking in when we do sound checks. So again, thank you all for joining, whether you're at an extension office or if you're at home. I'm glad that you're able to join us today, and we do have other programs coming up, which I'm sure you're aware of, and we'll go over some at the end. So today, let me introduce myself. My name is Diane Plewa. I'm the Plant Diagnostic Outreach Specialist at the University of Illinois Plant Clinic, and I'm part of Extension. And today I'm going to talk about Quercus Quandaries, or common oak pests in Illinois. And I specifically chose oaks for a couple of reasons. First of all, because they are, oops, looks like Unit 23 is having some problems. Let me just ask our host if this is something that...
Yeah, go ahead and keep going, Diane. We'll message her.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so I decided to choose oaks to talk about this season, partially because they're an important tree, to Illinois. There are 21 native oaks in Illinois. We've also imported a number of them, and we use them in a lot of our landscapes. They're important as native trees in our environment. And they are something that I think most people, either have oak trees or they really like their oak trees. You see them in front of libraries, banks, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about some common oak pests in Illinois. The majority of these pests are going to be disease issues, but I do mention some insects and some abiotic issues as well. And then at the end, if we have time, I'm happy to take questions. And you'll also have my contact information. So first, though, I'd like to take a couple minutes to introduce the plant clinic for those of you who are unfamiliar with us. We are located on the Urbana campus of the University of Illinois, and you have our contact information here along with our mailing address, our phone number. We have a website, we have a Facebook, which is the kind of one of our major ways of doing outreach. We're currently posting 40 pictures of fungi this summer for our 40th anniversary. So you're welcome to come join us and look at pretty pictures of fungus. And then also our plant clinic email address that will reach myself or the director of the plant clinic. And so if you have any questions that you think that we can help with, you're more than welcome to contact us, and we will either try to get the answer or put you in contact with a group that can help. So a little bit about the plant clinic. We are the federally designated diagnostic lab for Illinois. Most states have one, some have multiple labs, and some have none, whereas here in Illinois, we are the only one. And we are part of the National Plant Diagnostic Network, which is a network of diagnostic labs set up to streamline communication and sharing of trends of what we're seeing across regions. We cooperate with state and federal agencies, including USDA, the Illinois Department of Ag, Illinois Department of Natural Resources, and multiple others. And we also cooperate with diagnostic labs across the country. And our mission is diagnostics, training, and outreach. And so in this capacity, we obviously diagnose a bunch of plants that come into the clinic every year. We do training both for students at the university. I actually got my start at the plant clinic as an undergrad. And so we try to make sure that we give people the chance to come in and work in a diagnostic lab and get some hands-on experience. We also do master gardener training in a number of areas, and we do first detector trainings. And then that also kind of spills over into our outreach. We do a number of fact sheets, things like this presentation. This is actually the part of my job that I really like. I like talking to people about sick plants, which doesn't always make me the most popular person to talk with, but I get really excited by sick plants. And in terms of who we serve, we work with professionals in the agronomic and nursery production, green industry, homeowners and private citizens, researchers, students, and professors from various universities. And we accept samples from Illinois, but our permits allow us to accept plant material from all 50 states and overseas territories. So every so often we get a fun, exotic sample. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on oak problems. And plant problems in general are caused kind of by three main categories of issues. We have diseases that are caused by pathogens. We have damage that can be caused by insects or animals, sometimes by us, by humans. And then we also have abiotic issues that are caused by environmental or cultural conditions. So a disease is something like oak wilt, which is caused by a fungus. Damage can be an insect chewing on the leaves, but it could also be like a human damaging the base of the trunk with a weed whacker or a lawnmower, something like that. And an abiotic issue could be something like flooding or drought, both of which we've dealt with a lot in the last few years. And when I say cultural conditions, that's usually how we interact with the plants. So if we plant a tree in a bad location, if we plant it somewhere where it gets too much sun or too little sun, that would be a cultural problem. And so for the rest of this presentation, I kind of broke the rest of the presentation into seasons because the majority of these issues vary depending on the season. Some diseases are favored by different environmental conditions. Insects are at certain life stages that may be more or less damaging to the plants. And then obviously we have different weather at different times of the year. So I set this presentation up to walk through the growing season and kind of highlight some of the common problems that we see during certain seasons. So we're going to start with spring. And in spring, our weather is wet and cool. And we often see these mirrored patterns of injury, and you'll see some pictures of those in a moment. But we get these patterns of injury to the leaves where the damage is mirrored, and it's due to damage that was sustained while the leaves were still in the bud. So while the leaves were still folded, something happened that damaged that developing tissue, and then as they expand, that damage is mirrored on both sides of the leaf. And then we also have rapid leaf development. So we have plants that are growing very quickly. And this can lead to like a chlorotic issue that, again, we'll look at pictures of in a moment. One of our really, really common diseases is anthracnose. We see this every year. Every spring we see this. It's a common fungal disease, and it's favored by cool, wet weather. So as you can imagine, we see it a lot in spring, and then it tends to taper off as we get into summer. It tends to be a cosmetic problem. It very rarely causes lasting damage to healthy trees. However, it is very ugly. You get these dark brown necrotic or dead lesions on the leaf. They tend to be indistinct or amorphous, so they're just these big dead patches. They're not really nice round spots. They're not, nice angular areas. They're just these big dead spots. So it can look quite dramatic. But again, this is usually considered a cosmetic problem, and there is no management that's recommended other than maintaining plant vitality. And we're going to talk at the very end what I mean by maintaining tree vitality, because I'm going to mention that a lot for the rest of this presentation. But with anthracnose, and this is a disease that affects a wide number of trees, they are all slightly different species or different genera. So what's affecting your oak tree is not going to be what's affecting your sycamore. But when we talk about anthracnose diseases, they're all these fungal diseases that occur on the leaves that you get these big, dead, blotchy areas. And for the vast majority of them, they're not considered a significant threat. So this is an example of some of the mirrored injury. It's kind of a difficult thing to say quickly. This is an example of what we talked about earlier. In the picture on the left, where you have the red oak group leaves with the holes in them, you can see that there is this line of holes, and some of them are mirrored on either side of the main vein. And this is actually due to insect feeding. It's the oak shothole leaf miner, and for some reason we have seen so much of oak shothole leaf miner this year. It's been kind of crazy. I don't know exactly why this has happened, but we've gotten a number of samples that have these very clear round holes that, again, are often kind of lined up along the vein, or they're on either side of the vein. And what's happening is, again, the leaf is folded in the bud, the insect is feeding on that folded bud, and then as it expands, you get these lovely kind of patterns of damage. On the right, we have something called oak tatters, which again is a fairly common condition. In this case, it's not there isn't a single cause that's been identified as the reason behind oak tatters. However, it is something that we see very frequently. It occurs where you have the leaves where the interveinal tissue doesn't develop. So you get these very lacy, almost skeletonized leaves that will come out in spring. Oftentimes, the plant will put out a second flush of leaves because these are so damaged. Again, no single factor has been identified as the cause of oak tatters. It is suspected that the damage occurs while the leaves are still in the bud. Again, hence this very mirrored injury that we're seeing. And the damage may be due to low temperatures, insect feeding, or insects laying eggs in the buds, and also herbicide exposure. And again, the management for both of these is going to be increasing tree vitality. Neither of these problems by themselves, despite the fact that oak tatter is particularly disturbing, but neither of these things are going to kill a tree. They are going to cause stress to the tree, and that repeated years of stress can start to cause some long-term problems. But that's something that we can address by trying to reduce stress on the tree, which again we'll talk about at the very end of this presentation. Nutrient chlorosis is something we see every year, and it's caused by nutrient deficiencies, which are usually due to a soil pH problem. And the reason for this, and it's a little counterintuitive, when you tell someone that their tree looks like it has a nutrient deficiency, the first thing they want to do is go inject or amend the soil or spray the tree with more of that nutrient, which makes sense. You're saying it's a deficiency. But what usually tends to happen with nutrient chlorosis is not that the soil itself is deficient in the nutrient, it's that the soil pH is too far from neutral. So it's usually too acidic. And so we end up with a situation where these vital nutrients or micronutrients become bound in the soil, and so they are unavailable for plant uptake. So just adding more of the nutrients to the soil is not going to help that tree. It's not going to make it more available to the tree. And iron, manganese, and zinc are the most common deficiencies, but they all have kind of similar symptomology, and the treatment is the same. We often find that soil compaction and flooding exacerbate these symptoms, also rapid growth. So going back to that idea that in spring we see rapid foliar development, that can exacerbate some of these nutrient chlorosis issues. So the management is to determine and address the cause of deficiency. There are soils that are deficient in these nutrients, and in that case, you need to amend the soil and try and get those nutrients back into the soil. But again, the vast majority of the time, it's a pH issue. So we recommend that people do a soil pH test first, because homeowner soil pH test kits fairly cheaply. Go ahead and do a soil pH test. If the pH is too far from neutral, let's work on getting that pH back closer to 6.5 to 7, in that kind of range. If the soil pH looks good, then doing a larger soil test to determine nutrient availability would be the way to go. And there are foliar sprays for severe cases. I've got a picture of that right here. So this is nutrient chlorosis. On the left we have a maple tree, but it looks very, very similar on oaks. Pin oaks are particularly prone to this. And chlorosis is where we have this lovely yellowy green, almost like a lime green color to the leaves. This is much lighter than they would otherwise be, but the veins stay dark, dark, dark green. So you have these dark green veins with lime green leaves, which is weird looking. This is not what the maple tree is supposed to look like. And then if it progresses, the picture on the right with the oak leaves, that's what really severe chlorosis looks like. At this point, the leaves themselves are yellow. The veins are still a darker green, but they're not as dark as they should be. And then we're actually beginning to get marginal, we're beginning to get large portions of dying leaf tissue because the leaves are dying back. They're so badly affected. In this case, these yellow leaves, and we're beginning to actually have tissue death, that is where we would recommend a foliar spray. The foliar spray only helps the leaves that it contacts, so it's not going to help any new leaves that come out. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's going to give some relief to this poor tree that is clearly suffering. So again, this is something we see every year, is nutrient chlorosis. And if it's mild, the trees come out of it and it's fine. And again, waterlogged soil, injury to the roots can exacerbate these problems. So it's expected that we see this in spring when it gets really rainy. But if this continues, or if you start to see dieback, like on that right-hand picture, that's when we start to have some issues. We start to get worried about the overall health of the tree. So then moving into summer, weather is hot and humid like it has been for the last couple of weeks for us. The plants are going to have a high metabolic rate, so they are photosynthesizing like crazy, and they're either putting all of that energy into flowering or into fruiting or into setting seed or into diverting some of that down into the roots, but most of it's going to go into reproduction right now. And at this point, drought stress can become an issue. Tubakia is a very common fungal disease that we see basically every year. The infection is initiated in spring, so by the time we see it in summer, where the symptoms begin to appear, it's too late to really protect the tree from Tubakia because that infection has already started. The symptoms are pretty classic. You get down, they're usually fairly round or oval lesions that show up. They look very, they're fairly large lesions. So they're very obvious on trees. And then as they grow, they'll begin to expand, and then they can coalesce to form these larger kind of patches. Again, it's ugly, so it is a cosmetic problem, but management is not recommended. And this is for a couple of reasons. At least chemical management is not recommended. And this is due to the fact that, first of all, Tubakia does not pose a threat to the overall well-being of a healthy tree. It's ugly, but it's not going to really harm the tree's overall ability, its overall vitality. The other issue is that the chemical managements that we have are things like foliar sprays, like a contact fungicide, which they work, but if you think about oak trees, most of them get fairly large. And to be able to treat this disease and actually have an effect on it, we would have to get good coverage on a large tree. And at that point, that becomes fairly expensive. That's a lot of chemical that you have to buy. And also, you need some pretty sophisticated equipment to be able to really get good coverage over a 35-foot tree. So generally speaking with Tubakia, if this were a sapling, a 3-year-old tree, something that was still kind of going through some transplant stress, and I felt confident that I could get good coverage with like a hand sprayer, I might consider that. But for most large established trees, Tubakia is not going to be a problem, and it's going to be more of a problem to try to treat it than it will be in terms of posing a threat to the overall health of the tree. Leaf blister is a very similar disease in that it's a common fungal disease. Infection is initiated in spring, but symptoms don't appear until the summer. And again, it's considered a cosmetic problem. Leaf blister, it's closely related to plum pocket. For any of you that have plums that have had these similar symptoms, you get these kind of light yellow or green patches on the leaf, and if you actually pick up a leaf, there are these pockets where those yellow patches are. It's wrinkly and it's almost like a gall. It's distorted tissue. Again, no management is going to be recommended because this does not pose a threat to the overall well-being of the tree. It is a little aesthetically unpleasing. Sometimes you can get some brown discoloration as well, like around the outside of the blister, but it's not going to be a threat to a tree. And again, chemical management is going to be difficult because you're talking about spraying a fairly large tree. So we had one question: how can you tell the difference between anthracnose and Tubakia? So that's a really good question because they're both really common problems. A couple of differences right off the bat. Anthracnose usually shows up in spring when it's cool and wet. Tubakia shows up in summer as things get a little bit drier. Another big difference is that anthracnose causes these big brown amorphous lesions that just look like big patchy ugliness. It's the only way I can think of to describe it. Tubakia looks somewhat similar, but with Tubakia you can usually see fairly distinct ovals or circles on the leaves. And now again, those circles may expand and coalesce, so you'll still see some kind of patchy dead areas, but you should be able to see some initial spotting that's going on. Again, though, part of it's going to be based on when you see the samples or when, like what sort of weather you're going through at that time. And the good news is that the management for anthracnose and Tubakia, for the most part, is very similar. There are fungicide sprays that are available, but generally speaking, we don't recommend them because both of these diseases are not considered threats to the overall health of the tree. So we recommend sanitation, and we recommend increasing tree vitality. And again, we'll talk about those at the very end of the presentation. But that's a really good question. So leaf galls, I think probably everyone is familiar with leaf galls. I mean, if you've ever seen an oak leaf that's fallen on the ground, you've probably seen it covered in balls or spots or little cushions or little blisters or random protrusions. Leaf galls come in all different shapes and sizes, and part of that's because there are several hundred different types of leaf galling insect. So all of these galls are caused by insects, and usually the general the general kind of life cycle is you have this insect and it's going to be laying eggs on the leaf. And when it deposits its eggs, it also deposits basically compounds that make the leaf curl or gall, and it forms a protective pocket, either around eggs or around juvenile insects. So you get these on all different types of oaks. It affects white oak group trees and red oak group trees. They will sometimes just cause a gall or a deformation of the leaf. Sometimes if you get enough of them, as with these pictures, you'll actually get some tip dieback of the leaf tissue itself. But you can see those galls, those little cushion shaped structures on the underside of the leaf. Sometimes they're on the above side of the leaf. Sometimes they're on the leaf vein. So they can show up anywhere. The good news is that, again, they're very, very dramatic looking, and if you get the really big ones, they can be somewhat unsightly. But again, these are considered cosmetic problems. They tend to show up in summer. They start in summer and they can develop all the way through fall. Again, no management is recommended because at the life cycle that the insects are in, it's going to be difficult to control. And again, we're talking about a huge tree. Generally speaking, what we recommend for leaf galls is again, sanitation and increasing tree vitality. So those were leaf galls or foliar galls. We also have twig galls, which again are common insect issues, and there are two common types of twig galls, which can be serious for younger trees or stressed trees. And the management for these twig galls is to prune out and destroy the galls, and then to try to maintain plant vigor. So the good news is that when you have a young tree, it's a little bit easier to reach most of the branches, and so pruning isn't such a problem. When you start getting into, again, the larger mature trees, it's going to be impossible to prune out all of those galls. So then we focus on increasing plant vigor. So here are some pictures. The two twig galls that we see most frequently are something called horned oak gall and gouty oak gall. And the horned oak gall is here on the left, the small square picture that shows a close-up of the gall. And I think you can figure out why it's called horned oak gall, because you have the little horns sticking out of it. Whereas gouty oak gall looks very similar to that, but it doesn't have horns. And that's what we're seeing in the picture on the right. And so these galls form on the twigs or on the branches, and once they form, they can actually basically cut off the vascular system to the rest of that branch, and so you can start getting tip dieback. And that's why these are considered more serious. The foliar galls, they will distort the leaf tissue, possibly cause some damage to the leaf tissue, but then the leaves, at worst case scenario, they'll fall off the tree, and the tree will put out new leaves if it's early enough in the year, or it will just conserve its energy and put out new leaves next year. Whereas with these twig galls, this can actually cause twig death because it's girdling them, or even branch death if it's on a small enough tree. So a good time to scout for galls, I said that they develop usually in summer going into fall, but a good time to scout for them is in winter. Again, the picture on the right, you can see them very clearly when there are no leaves on the tree. It would be much harder to see all these galls from ground level if this tree was fully leafed out. I worked with someone that said that twig galls were the way of identifying an oak tree when you're going 60 miles down the interstate, because you can just see all the galls, and that's something to look for. If this tree, the one on the right that we're looking at that has no leaves on it because it's a winter picture, if that tree is an otherwise healthy tree, if every year it puts out a nice flush of leaves, if the leaves are a nice dark green healthy color, if the crown of the tree looks good, if the base of the tree looks good, if I know that there's no soil compaction going on, there's no root rot, no flooding, then this would not really bother me. If, on the other hand, in summer, I began to notice dieback. I began to notice that the leaves are smaller than usual. They're a lighter green color. The tree doesn't look as vigorous. If I know that there was recently construction nearby that may have affected the tree, that's when we start to worry. again, with a large tree, pruning out all of these twig galls is not really feasible, but we can increase tree vitality, and that's what we would focus on in this situation. So I'm going to move on to oak wilt, which is a disease that I think most people have probably heard of just because it's a very serious disease. Up until now, most of the things we've talked about have been minor problems, cosmetic problems, things that we don't worry too much about. Oak wilt is unfortunately not one of those. This is a serious fungal disease. It affects the vascular system of the tree. So the vascular system is how the tree moves water and nutrients around. It's kind of like our circulatory system. So anything that affects that vascular system is going to have a huge effect on the tree's health. Oak wilt causes a half-leaf scorch, a sudden decline, and death. And in red oak tree groups, excuse me, or in the red oak group, trees can die in a single season. Like a large mature tree can die in one season. With the white oaks, it tends to take 2 to 4 years to kill the tree. So unfortunately, people will say, oh, but white oaks are more resistant. Well, a little bit, but if you're looking at the difference between killing a tree in 1 year or killing a tree in 3 years, those are both problematic. Sounds like someone's microphone is on, so if people could check, that would be great. And make sure to mute your microphones. Thank you. One of the other problems with oak wilt, though, is that, again, it causes a vascular it impacts the vascular system, so it's causing a problem to the circulation of the tree, which means you get this half-leaf scorch, but that's not particularly diagnostic. There are other things that can cause very similar symptoms. So oak wilt, because it can be difficult to diagnose in the field and because it's such a serious disease, we recommend that people send samples to us or to any diagnostic lab so that they can definitive answer yes or no, if their tree is infected, because the management for this tree is to remove the affected tree. The reason for that is that if you have a tree that is infected with oak wilt, you do not want it acting as a source of inoculum for the other trees in the area. And so what we recommend is if a tree is identified as having oak wilt, first you trench around the tree, a couple feet away from the base of the tree, you go through and you trench. And the reason for that is to break any root grafts that may exist between your oak tree and other oak trees in the area. Unfortunately, red oaks can graft very easily with other red oaks, and white oaks can graft easily with white oaks, and that is a great way for this pathogen to spread between trees. You also want to avoid wounding the oak tree during the growing season, and this is critical. And the reason for this is that the pathogen, the fungus, it doesn't spread very well on its own, but it is vectored from an infected tree to a healthy tree by a beetle. And this beetle is attracted to trees that have wounds. And then when it gets to a tree, let's say that you did prune your oak tree, and this beetle shows up at the wound, you now have a perfect infection site. You have a big wound that when the beetle crawls all over your tree and it's the fungal spores fall off of its legs or its thorax, it has a perfect entry to the vascular system of the tree. So we really recommend trying to avoid wounding your oak trees during the growing season. Ideally, wait until the tree is dormant. However, if you absolutely must prune, we recommend waiting until fall because that's when the beetle is less active. The beetles are the most active in spring and early summer. So do everything you can to avoid pruning and avoid wounding oak trees in that period. So these are some pictures of symptoms of what we call classic oak wilt. But again, keep in mind that there are a lot of other things that can look fairly similar to this. However, you can see a half-leaf scorch, and it usually starts at the tip and it works its way in. So you end up with these leaves that are half dead. They're half brown and then part of them still isn't. Like I said, we really recommend that people send samples to us. They suspect oak wilt because it's kind of critical to figure out if the tree is infected or not. Oak wilt sampling is a little bit tricky. So we request that you send samples that are 8 to 10 inches long. The samples must come from symptomatic branches. If you send us a sample that is from a branch that looks completely healthy, then there's a decent chance that the pathogen has not moved into that branch yet. So you'll get a negative even if the tree itself does have oak wilt. Also, please do not send completely dead branches, because at that point the pathogen is long gone. Pathogens like dying tissue. They don't usually like dead tissue. And so dead branches we have a really hard time working with. We request that they're about 8 to 10 inches long, about the diameter of your thumb, so about 1 inch in diameter. And you can look for vascular discoloration. Sometimes it can be really easy to see. When you peel back the bark, you'll see small brown streaks. You'll see some brown discoloration. Other trees, it can be a lot more difficult to find. For those of you that are familiar with verticillium wilt, which is another vascular wilt disease, you know that on some trees, like maples, for example, you'll get this beautiful green streaking. As soon as you cut off the bark, you'll see this beautiful green streaking on certain trees with verticillium wilt. That is unfortunately not the case with oak wilt. It's much more subtle, so it can be difficult to find that vascular discoloration. And then we highly recommend that you ship via next day delivery if possible, and try to keep the sample cold. So ship it with a cold pack, or even just a water bottle that's halfway filled up with water, and you throw it in the freezer for a couple of hours. This pathogen, despite the fact that it can kill a fully mature 200-year-old oak tree in less than a year, this pathogen dies really quickly once that sample is removed from the tree. And that's why we recommend shipping via next day delivery. It also really does not do well in hot temperatures, and so we recommend trying to keep it cold. Oops. So one thing that can often be confused with oak wilt is drought. That's again something we tend to see starting in summer, because as we get further and further into the year, the plants have gone longer and longer from that lovely. So again, this is a common problem in late summer. Again, it's usually a cosmetic problem, but it does cause stress to the trees. And trees, like us, the more stressed they get, the more susceptible they are to other problems, and the less able they are to heal from some of these issues. So we really recommend just trying to reduce stress. If there's one theme that you take from this presentation today, I hope it's reduce stress on your trees. And this drought stress especially comes up when we're talking about fairly recently transplanted trees. So most people know that transplant shock is a thing, and that you have to take care of transplants. What most people, I think, don't realize necessarily is that transplant care usually takes 3 or more years. Most people think, well, I'm going to put the tree in, I'll make sure I mulch it, I'll water it for the first several months, and it will be fine. And it may be, if it's a particularly healthy tree, if it's in a good location, if we have a very forgiving summer, then yes, that can go very well. But most recommendations for dealing with transplants is to continue watering, supplemental watering, for up to 3 years after they are installed. To continue to mulch them, to try to fertilize them appropriately, things like that. So just be aware that this drought stress can be particularly damaging to newly transplanted trees, because they just don't have the root system to compensate. So again, it's a cosmetic problem, but it does cause stress. The management, obviously, is going to be to water. Also, though, you want to make sure that you check the base of the tree and the roots for damage, because we've seen this happen before, usually on mature trees, where the leaves will start exhibiting symptoms of drought stress, but we're having a fairly wet season, and so we can't figure out what's going on. And it's not because there isn't enough water in the environment, it's because either the roots were damaged or the base of the tree was damaged, and so the tree can't take that water up. So it's not that the water isn't available, it's just not available to that tree anymore. And then again, improving tree vitality, which again we will go over at the end. But this picture of drought stress, one thing that's kind of classic drought stress of this picture is that you're getting interveinal necrosis. So the necrosis, the dead brown areas, are occurring between the veins. But again, I have seen drought stress that mimics oak wilt. I've seen oak wilt that mimics drought stress. So that can be tricky to kind of be able to give a good diagnosis just by looking at the leaves. And then as we move into fall, we're moving into cooler, wet weather. It's the end of the growing season, and the plants begin to senesce, and so they begin to enter dormancy. Powdery mildew is a really common disease, and we see this all year long on different hosts. You tend to see turf powdery mildew in spring. You see things like lilac powdery mildew or bee balm powdery mildew in summer. Peony powdery mildew tends to show up a little bit later. Oak powdery mildew tends to show up in fall, but it can show up earlier. So I just listed a whole bunch of different hosts for powdery mildew. And one thing I want to make clear is that powdery mildew is it's a group of diseases. So it's kind of like anthracnose we talked about at the very beginning. Anthracnose is a group of diseases that can affect a wide range of hosts, but they're all different species. And same with powdery mildew. So your turf is not giving powdery mildew to your peonies. Your oak tree cannot catch powdery mildew from your bee balm, even if they all have powdery mildew. They're all different species. So powdery mildew is a common fungal disease. It's actually one of my favorite fungal diseases because I think it's really cool. You can see a lot of different structures even without a microscope, and it has one of the coolest names. And for any of you who have taken Master Gardener training with me, I think you know where this is going. But when you look at this picture, you have the oak leaf. It has a white tinge to it. That's the powdery mildew aspect. And then it's got these little black spots. And those little black spots are fruiting structures of the pathogen. And that's actually how the pathogen overwinters. And this is one of the coolest words in the English language, although I'm not sure if I should say that since it's Latin. But anyway, it's one of the coolest words. Those little fruiting structures are called Cleistothecia. And I just think that's a beautiful word. I often joke that if I have a daughter, there's a decent chance she might end up with Cleistothecia, at least as a middle name. I think that could be really nice. But again, it's a common disease. We see it all the time. Like many of the things we've talked about today, it's considered a cosmetic problem. Generally speaking, it's not going to damage an otherwise healthy tree. So there's no management recommended other than increasing tree vitality. And, pointing it out to your neighbors and talking to them about Cleistothecia, because that is the way to become the most popular person in the neighborhood. I've tried it. It works. Another serious disease, and this is actually our first bacterial disease that we've talked about today, is bacterial leaf scorch, or BLS. And this affects a wide range of trees, and unlike powdery mildew or anthracnose, this is all the same bacteria. So it's the same pathogen affecting a huge host range. We test for this disease in fall. Excuse me. We test for this disease in fall, and the symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch, again, can mimic oak wilt. They can mimic drought stress. They can mimic anthracnose to a certain extent. And so we recommend that if someone suspects bacterial leaf scorch, that they actually get it tested. We test in fall for a specific reason. The bacterial populations, they rise through the year. So they start off in spring fairly low, and then they increase during the year, and then once we get really cold weather, they crash again. And so we choose to test in usually August and September, so that we're really testing at a time where their populations should be high. So if the tree does have bacterial leaf scorch, we are going to catch it. We just don't want to give anyone a false negative just because their population was too low. In terms of management for bacterial leaf scorch, there are trunk injections of antibiotics that are recommended. And if you have a tree that is a historically important tree, a tree that's really important in your landscape for aesthetic reasons, if you're about to sell your house, if you have a tree that is important to you personally, these injections may be appropriate. But one thing I just want to make clear is that these trunk injections will suppress the symptoms, usually for just a couple of weeks, but they don't cure the tree. And so these injections are something that will need to be recurring every year. And on top of that, injections do wound the tree to a certain extent. You have to actually, stick a needle in the base of the tree. And there's been some concern that repeated wounding can also weaken the tree and act as a place for secondary invaders, wood rots, things like that. So with bacterial leaf scorch, there is a chemical management, but there are some pretty strict limitations on what to expect from that management. Sanitation has not been shown to be very effective, unfortunately. So what we found is that if you have one tree on your property that has bacterial leaf scorch, if there are other trees that are showing similar symptoms, they probably all also have bacterial leaf scorch, unfortunately. We still recommend that those trees are removed just because they are going to start to decline and look really bad, but it doesn't necessarily save the other trees nearby. And then again, reducing stress. So bacterial leaf scorch tends to show up on stressed trees. So if we can reduce some of that stress, we have a better chance of the trees either being able to fight off a minor infection or recover. So these are kind of, again, classic symptoms of bacterial leaf scorch. I think you can see why it would be easy to mistake these pictures for oak wilt. Again, you have that kind of half-leaf scorch starting at the tip, working its way back. A couple things to note on these pictures is that on the picture on the left, which is a beautiful picture, I did not take it, but it is a gorgeous picture, we have the necrotic regions, or the brown areas of brown tissue, and then we have the nice healthy green tissue, and there's that yellow margin in between the two regions. So you have the green and then this nice yellow kind of outline, and then the brown. And some people will tell you that that's what to look for bacterial leaf scorch, is you look for that yellow distinction. That yellow line or that yellow margin will show up on some bacterial leaf scorch infected leaves, but not all of them. And so if you see something that looks like this, then yes, I would say that it looks classic for, or it looks characteristic of, bacterial leaf scorch. But you will often see things that do not have that yellow line that are still positive for bacterial leaf scorch. And a good example of that is to the right of this picture. We have the other leaf, the single leaf, and you can see this is another kind of classic sign of bacterial leaf scorch, or classic symptom, where you have some browning, but it almost looks like someone took a healthy leaf and then just kind of dipped it in like brown watercolors. They just kind of dipped it, or like dipped it in coffee maybe. But it's not a distinct lesion. You know, like there's no big brown patches on the leaf. There's just a vague browning. And you'll note there's not specifically any yellow margins in that area. And so bacterial leaf scorch, because it has wide host range, but also because the symptoms can vary, this can make it very difficult to diagnose it just by looking at the leaves. And last year I posted this picture, and I posted it on our Facebook, and I asked people to tell me which one or ones of these leaves were positive for bacterial leaf scorch. Is anyone brave enough to type in which ones they think, or jump on the mic? I feel like I should have a catchy little song right here. Do, 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 do. All right, we had one very brave person, Pam. She suspects that all of them are positive for bacterial leaf scorch. And congratulations, Pam, you are correct. I wish I had a prize to give you. I don't, unless you want some infected plant tissue. I've got lots of that. But yeah, all of these are positive. So the one in the middle, most people would suspect for having bacterial leaf scorch because it has that nice yellow margin. You know, you've got the green healthy looking tissue, you've got the brown discolored tip, and then you have this lovely yellow margin. And that is correct. That has bacterial leaf scorch. The one on the far right, it looks like that picture I showed you before, where you have a green leaf that just kind of got dipped in brown paint or dipped in coffee. So it has kind of a brown tinge to it, but not necessarily like huge necrotic areas. That one was also positive. But then the one on the left, I'm sorry, I really hope that my left and your left is matching up. But the one on the left, right underneath the university, that one, that looks like it definitely could be bacterial leaf scorch. It also looks like it could be oak wilt, and it looks like it could be environmental scorch if the scorch was acting a little bit weird that day. So again, some of these foliar problems can be very difficult to diagnose just by looking at the leaves, and part of the reason is because the pathogens, while the pathogens are all different, they're all acting the same way. Bacterial leaf scorch is plugging up the vascular system. Oak wilt is plugging up the vascular system. Environmental scorch is because there isn't enough liquid flowing through the vascular system. So I think you can understand a lot of these, the symptoms are similar because the reason that the plant is exhibiting the symptoms are similar. And then I want to talk about bur oak, or Bob, as he is affectionately known. But Baroque Blight it's a serious fungal disease, but out of all of the serious fungal diseases that we have talked about today, Bob is great because there is effective management that does not involve removing the tree. So Bob is a great disease to get if you're going to get a serious oak disease. It only affects bur oaks. So if you don't have a bur oak, you don't have to worry about Bob. Right now, it's been found in northwestern areas of Illinois. However, last year we did get a suspect sample. Well, we got pictures from Grundy County, so it was moving a little bit further south from where we've traditionally seen it. Most of Iowa almost all the counties in Iowa have reported positive samples of Bob, and many areas of Minnesota and Wisconsin have also reported Bob. So this is something that I guess I expect is a little bit more widespread in Illinois than we currently live for, but I think that either people just don't recognize it or we're just not getting those samples. So again, right now it's found in northwestern areas of Illinois, but I would suspect that it could be everywhere, at least down to central Illinois. And it causes a wedge-shaped necrotic lesion on the leaf. And I'll show you some pictures. It's very distinct. So this is also a lovely disease because this one tends to look fairly different as opposed to all those other ones we looked at that look kind of the same. So the management for Bob, again, this is something we can actually do something about. Increase tree vigor. Well, that's something we talk about for almost all of these. Prune and remove dead branches. Getting rid of dead tissue is generally speaking a good idea no matter what. But again, remember, you want to do it when the tree is dormant if possible. And then you can use trunk injections of propiconazole. And propiconazole is a fungicide. The nice thing, though, is that data out of Iowa show that you only have to do the injection once, and then you might have to do it, and then it's recommended that you re-inject later after another severe outbreak. So instead of having to do it every year or every even 2 years, this is something that you do it when you see the symptoms, and then you could wait 5 or 10 years before you have to re-inject. So it's not something that's going to repeatedly cost you a lot of money, and it also is not repeatedly wounding the tree. So again, Baroque Blight, prognosis, fairly good. So here are some pictures of Baroque Blight. On the left, this is the initial symptomology where you see the top of the leaf and you see that the veins are turning kind of a purpley brown color. The veins are turning a little bit necrotic on the upper side of the leaf. Again, that's the initial symptoms. The two pictures on the right, the middle, and then on the right, we have that nice wedge-shaped necrosis. And so in the middle, you can see it's basically a tip dieback, but it ends at a vein. And so you get this wedge shape. It's a V shape. Again, on the very far right, we got that sample in last year, and the first thing I said to one of our coworkers when I opened the box, I was like, look at this wedge. This is a nice wedge. Because again, it's just a very distinct symptom. And this is, unfortunately, to confirm, Bob, we actually have to find petioles that have overwintered. So we have to find the little bits of the tree that the leaf connects to the branch. We have to find a petiole that has overwintered that season. So it can be a little bit difficult to positively confirm it, but really that wedge-shaped necrosis is classic, and there aren't a lot of things that look similar. So we've talked a lot about today about increasing tree vigor and reducing tree stress. Well, how do you do that? Hard. And a lot of it seems like common sense, but I think a lot of times people either take their trees for granted because they've been in the landscape for so long, it's kind of like lawn art. They'll always be there. Or because people, and I'm totally guilty of this, I was taught in grade school that, you know, you look at the upper side of the tree, and however tall the tree is and however wide the tree is, that's what the roots look like. Turns out that is not true. And so a lot of trees have much more shallow roots than we might expect. And so because of that, I think a lot of times we don't water trees during periods of dryness because we figure, well, they've got deep roots, they'll be fine, and they will be fine, but it will stress them out. And then if anything else, you know, any other foliar disease, or if an insect problem, or if anything else comes up, it's going to make it more difficult on that tree to recover. And so in terms of what we can do, water. We highly recommend that people water their trees during periods of dryness lasting more than 1 to 2 weeks in summer, which isn't that frequent, but we have had summers in the not too distant past where we had large periods of time where we had no water at all, and there were people that did not water at all. So, you know, be nice to your tree, put a hose out, make sure the tree gets a little bit of water. Mulching correctly. Unfortunately, this clip art of the happy tree has grass growing up to the base, which is not ideal. We recommend that people mulch the tree out to the drip line if possible. And there are a couple of reasons that we recommend this. One of them is because mulch does help retain soil moisture, and it helps even out like soil moisture fluctuation, and so your tree isn't going through feast or famine. It kind of has a nice even moisture content around the roots. Also, because by mulching you're discouraging weeds and grass from growing up to the base of the tree. Grass is a wonderful competitor. It's a very good competitor for water and for nutrients. And so especially when I see little baby saplings planted in the middle of someone's lawn with grass going straight up to the base, I just feel bad for that tree. I mean, that poor tree has to really kind of, it's like when you have someone that has, 6 or 10 different siblings and you're kind of like, oh man, you really had to kind of use your elbows to make sure you had a place at the dinner table. So this tree, they need to have a little bit of space where they can put their own roots out and that they don't have to constantly compete. And again, grass is a great competitor. There are some other plants, like if you want to plant hosta, for example, under the tree, hosta tend to not have as large of a negative impact on root system development and things like that as grass does. And finally, by mulching and by not having grass grow all the way up to the tree, you are greatly reducing the possibility of running into your tree with a lawnmower or a weed whacker or something like that. It is amazing. And I mean, and I've done it, so it's, I totally understand how you're mowing, you're hot, there's sweat dripping in your eyes, and you're kind of like, whatever, I'll just go around the tree, and you end up clipping the tree and damaging it. And again, probably didn't kill the tree, but it's not going to help. And so by mulching, you kind of take care of a lot of those problems. Fertilize the tree properly. We recommend usually you fertilize in either late fall or early spring. Usually just kind of general balanced tree fertilizers are sufficient. You want to make sure that you're not doing anything that's really heavy on nitrogen, because sometimes people think, well, nitrogen promotes plant growth, so I should just use a lot of nitrogen. And it does promote plant growth, but it can actually force plants to grow a little too fast, and that new growth is very susceptible to disease and insect issues, so you want a balanced tree fertilizer. Again, you want to prune the trees when dormant. You don't want to be pruning them in mid-spring, early summer. That's the worst. If you can avoid pruning them until it's dormant, that's the best. And then sanitation. We talked a little bit about this, but sanitation usually refers to just removing all of the dead plant material. So in fall, and oak trees tend to hold on to their leaves a little bit longer than most other deciduous trees. But in fall or in winter, when the leaves finally fall down, or in spring when you start to wake your garden up, go ahead and rake and remove a lot of those leaves if you had some of these problems earlier in the year. If your tree is healthy and it drops its leaves and you want to leave those leaves in the landscape to act as like an organic mulch or to put those nutrients back in the soil, that's fine. But if you had really bad anthracnose that year, or if you had a lot of insect galls that year, or if you have a bur oak tree and you think you might have Baroque Blight, go ahead and just remove all of those leaves, because by doing so you're removing some of the inoculum or some of the insect pests from the environment. Your tree still may be affected because a lot of these things move very well in the environment through wind or through rain, or again being vectored by beetles or something like that, but you're at least making it so that there isn't this big reservoir of infection right under your tree. One thing I have seen recommended that I think is an interesting solution, there are people that really don't want to remove the leaves either because it's a lot of work or because they don't want to remove that organic matter from the environment. And so I've seen some publications recommending that you mulch directly on top of the leaves, because that way at least you are putting in a barrier between the leaves and the tree. And so that can be another possibility. So I have some resources listed for you here in terms of looking at specifically at oak problems or just in general. There is a plant clinic report. It's, I want to say, 6 or 12 pages long on oak problems, where we go over a lot of the issues that I talked about today. We talk about diseases, also insects, and biotic or abiotic problems, and you can download that from the URL on our website. We have a number of plant clinic fact sheets, and right now they are up on a box folder, and you have the URL for that. As we develop more fact sheets, these are usually 2-page, single page front and back, where we talk about common diseases in Illinois. And so go ahead and you can check there and download the ones that we currently have available. There is the Home Yard and Garden Pest newsletter, which I think many of you are probably familiar with. It's written for the professional, but I find that a lot of, basically anyone that has an interest or education about gardening or horticulture or landscaping can find that newsletter helpful, and it's written by specialists at the University of Illinois, and we talk about things that are happening as they happen in the state, so it's a very topical newsletter. And finally, we do have a blog. I'll be honest, I don't tend to update it very much during the growing season because I get kind of busy with samples, but you are more than welcome to check out our blog. We talk about things that are coming in the clinic or what we've been doing recently, something like that. And with that, you have my contact information. A lot of that is a lot of big words, but I think the two that will be the most helpful is at the bottom you have my phone number and you also have my email address. So you are more than welcome to contact me directly or contact the plant clinic, and you have that contact information at the beginning of this presentation. Please keep in mind you can view past recordings of these webinars on YouTube, and this one will actually be up in a little bit, and then all of the ones that have been done this season along with previous seasons are available there. So if you've missed any, make sure you check them out. And with that, we have a little bit of time. If anyone has any questions, please go ahead and either type them in or come on the microphone, and I will do my best to answer them. Thank you.
Wow. Hey, Diane, we've got a question in Champaign.
Uh-huh.
If you suspect oak wilt, how soon is it safe to cut a sample and not be risking the beetle infection invasion?
Okay, yeah, that's a really good question. So if you suspect oak wilt, basically what should you do? Because I just told you not to wound your tree or prune your tree during the growing season. Since oak wilt is such a severe disease, and because it's difficult when as the season progresses and as we get cooler temperatures and the tree begins to shut down and the fungus begins to kind of shut down as well, it can be harder for us to recover it. If you suspect oak wilt, we do recommend that you take a sample now. We are a little bit outside of the kind of prime time for beetle flying or for the beetles to spread the disease, so that's good. And when we're looking at sampling for oak wilt, we're looking at getting a branch that's about the diameter of your thumb. So it's a fairly small cut. You know, we're not having people go out and cut large branches or logs essentially from the tree. So we do recommend that if you suspect oak wilt, that now would be a good time to sample. And let's see, we have some other questions. How would you check the roots for drought stress without harming the roots or the tree? Okay, so with that, looking at the roots themselves, okay, so if you have a tree that you suspect has drought stress, how would you scout that tree? And a couple things I would do at the very beginning is, first off, look at the base of the tree. Make sure you don't see any wounding. Make sure that you don't see any large cankers or cracked bark or bleeding or holes, or let's just make sure everything looks good on the base of the tree. Also, when you're looking at the base of the tree, and this is something I did not specifically talk about, but we see happen to all sorts of trees, is something called deep planting, where the plants were installed too deeply. And it could be because either when they were installed, they weren't installed properly, or it could be because when they were installed, they were right at soil level, and then they had, as it rained, there was some soil subsidence, and the tree kind of sunk a little bit. And so one thing that happens, which is unfortunate, but one thing that can happen is that if you look at a tree, if you should see a root flare, you should see a nice kind of, area where the base of the tree comes away from the tree. So it should flare out as it enters the ground. If the tree goes straight down like a lollipop, that's a problem. And there, unfortunately, is not a whole lot you can do. What you can try to do is gently excavate and see like where that first root goes into the trunk. And if it's more than a couple inches down, the tree has been planted way too deeply. So you can try and make sure that the base of the tree looks good. Also check for girdling roots. And a lot of times girdling roots you can see on top of the soil surface. So that's something you can look for without really having to harm the tree too much. You can gently try to excavate and see, with your fingers or with very small trowels, and try to see what's going on. I would say if you suspect drought stress, though, the first thing I would do is do a visual observation, make sure you're not seeing any major problems, and then go ahead and maybe mulch the tree if possible, and try watering it on a regular basis and see if that helps the tree recover. If that does not help, then we can do a little bit more invasive issues. So I hope that helps Bruce. Next one, white oak in the front yard has had yellow leaves all year. The red and pin oaks in the backyard are okay. This person do a soil pH test. That's a weird one. I'm not going to lie, because usually the red oaks and the pin oaks are the ones that are the more prone to soil or to nutrient chlorosis, whereas the white oaks tend to be less prone to that. I would say a soil pH test couldn't hurt. Again, they're fairly cheap. I think I've seen them for even under like $5 in the or in a greenhouse center or garden centers or greenhouse stores, things like that. So a soil pH test probably wouldn't hurt. I don't know that that's the most likely issue though. And again, I would really tell that person to scout their tree really carefully. If it's a young tree, it could be a transplant issue. If it's an older tree, let's make sure that it's a healthy, mature tree that's well established in the environment. Because again, white oaks tend to be less prone to that chlorosis than the red oaks or the pin oaks. If you have a picture that you'd like to send the plant clinic email address, you could send us a picture and we could see if we could help you kind of determine what could be going on. Question about what effect climate change will have on our oaks. Ooh, man, someone's going for the like $100. That's more. It's a bigger question than a $100 question. It's like $1 million question. Do I have any prediction? So I'm not a climatologist. I will say a couple of things that I have read that I think are interesting. I mentioned Baroque Blight in this presentation, and I read a really interesting article that was looking at the fact that Baroque Blight, it's not an exotic disease. At first, when it showed up, because it showed up fairly rapidly and it just kind of came out of nowhere, and so we thought it was a exotic disease that had been imported accidentally, like so many of our really bad invasive diseases and pests. And so we thought it was something that had come in from out of the country and was now, devastating our native bur oaks. And it turns out, after doing a lot of research and digging through and looking at genetic mapping and things like that, that they don't think that the disease is an exotic disease. They think that Baroque Blight is a native disease, but that our spring weather has changed. Our springs have gotten warmer, and because of that, this disease has rapidly expanded in terms of its geographic location. So I think in terms of what sort of effects climate change can have on oak trees, all of our trees have evolved to live in certain areas, both in terms of the soil structure and in terms of are they in the middle of a forest or are they in the middle of a prairie, and also in terms of climate issues. And so as climate change begins to as the climate changes, I think that yes, that can have an effect, and I think that we may begin to see more of these diseases that used to be very small, localized diseases may become larger or more widespread, and maybe some of the diseases are going to become less effective. I'm not really sure how that might affect some of our common diseases. Maybe they'll become less common, but I think that it could definitely change what sort of pests that we're seeing. A question on how to amend the soil pH if it is not right. Okay, is this almost impossible for something as large as an oak? Oh, it can be a challenge. I'm not gonna try to soften the blow. Amending soil pH can definitely be an issue, and that's why something like a foliar spray can be very effective for trees that are really suffering, just to kind of give them some short-term relief. In terms of actually effectively amending the soil, I'm looking up an article right now that I'm going to post a link to, because there was a Home Yard and Garden article recently. Sorry. I always have to say chlorosis out loud as I spell it, because there's H's and L's and O's in there that I always forget about. So there was a recent article on iron chlorosis. There actually were two that I'm going to post for you, and they talk about how to amend the soil. Basically, it usually involves, and this is why you want to check to make sure the pH is off before you go through all of this, the difficulty of doing this, but it usually involves digging. So there's the first link. There's another one. They're from last year and this year, but it basically involves usually digging holes around the tree and then either or dumping, for lack of a better term, chemical or sorry, I'm having a complete mind shut down. basically it involves, you're not going to be like rototilling something into the soil because that would obviously destroy the roots. But what it does involve is trying to inject either into the soil, just kind of dig into the soil some of these compounds that can help affect the pH. And it's difficult. It can take a long time, but if you have a large tree, it's probably worth at least trying and see if we can kind of help that tree recover. And then let's see, 2 more questions. Can you recommend what to do for vertical 1/4 inch crack on a young 6 to 8 inch diameter trunk? I would leave it. We don't recommend using any type of Band-Aid, or we don't recommend using any type of sealant. So it used to be back in the day that, you know, people recommended using either sealants, or I remember there were trees on my street that the city had poured concrete into to try to help protect against, like, when a lightning strike occurred and there was, you know, a lot of internal damage. We don't recommend doing that anymore because a lot of times what ends up happening is you end up trapping pathogens or moisture or pests under that sealant, and that can just cause more problems in the long run. What I would probably do is, first of all, see if you can figure out what caused that crack. If it's on the southwest side of the tree, could it possibly be due to sun scald, or could it be due to frost cracking? Was it from an ovipositor from a cicada? Cicadas like to lay their eggs in branches or on trunks, and it can cause some cracking. You know, so see if you can figure out what caused that, and if it's something frost damage, that's something that you're going to want to try to prevent from happening in the future. If it was something like an insect ovipositor, well, there's not a whole lot you can do. If we're having a large number of insects or a large number of cicadas emerge this, in a specific year, you can wrap trees, but that's usually not as critical. I would say do not put anything on that. Keep an eye on it, and if the bark begins to continue to split, you can do bark pruning, where basically you just try to trim off the dead bark and allow that wound to heal. But I would say for right now, that's a very small crack, unless, yeah, that's a small crack. And so I would say go ahead and just keep an eye on it. Again, increase or maintain tree vitality, mulch it, water it, fertilize it, kind of baby it along. Keep an eye on the crack, make sure it doesn't get any bigger. But I would not recommend any form of like wound sealant or anything like that. And then one more, let's see. Red oak has a broken branch. It's not very big. Should I trim it off now or leave it? Personally, I would leave it until it's dormant, but I'm also really, really risk averse. So I really like my trees and I really don't want to hurt them. So I would probably trim it, or I would probably leave it now. If it's like dragging or you're afraid of it being a safety issue, if it's broken, you could always remove the part that has already snapped off, if that makes sense. So you could always remove the part of the branch that is trailing or that has fallen or that sort of thing. And then I would leave the stump, for lack of a better term, I would leave that until after October or November, once the tree goes dormant, and then prune that properly so that you can start getting healing. All right, I feel like I just did like 20 questions, except it wasn't 20. But those were all really good questions. I hope, like I said, I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. I hope it was informative. If you have further questions, if you wake up in the middle of the night tonight and you're like, oh, oak question, I should have asked Diane, you're more than welcome to email me, or you can contact the plant clinic and we will do what we can to help you with your plant problems. So thank you very much for joining us.